we have 3-week session. First, I just wanted to make sure how many have either watched the segment or know what we talked about. So let me just then briefly tell you what we covered, and the friends over here, they can help out with regard to what we covered. I just want to spend about 5 minutes on that, and with your help. We first discussed what mystics and mysticism is. Can some of you help? I think there were basically 3 or 4 definitions. Anyone likes to share what those thoughts were as to what mystics and mysticism is, or? Well,
mystics are searching for the divine.
Right. So mystics are those who are in search of the divine, what are called unencumbered. They don't want any barriers. They just want to keep searching and find God here and now. And then the other thing that we discussed was along the same line, that basically mystics are what we call are impatient in searching God, in reaching God. They just see Him now. And then the other definition was that mystics are those who want to bring to reality the idea of man is made in the image of God, right? So these were basically the 3 ways that mystics, who we said are called by different names in different religious traditions, talk about mystics and mysticism. Then we talked about the way, the practice of mysticism, as to how to get there. And we said the means to get from the animal to the divine, or from the animal for the lower side to the higher side, is what? Is through suffering. Is through suffering. And we had a sort of long discussion. I hope you particularly watched that segment of our discussion last time as to what that really means in the Baha'i faith, in all religious traditions. We said that is an aware and live suffering. That is a suffering that should be welcome. That's a suffering that we should long for, as Baha'u'llah says, and all religious traditions tell us. It is not something to be avoided. Whatever, this is in search of the divine in order to reach God. This is the idea of self-purification. How can I become better? And how can I become better? At times maybe not that easy, but then we need to want it. We want to yearn for it, right? In order to get it. And this is very important. This is really the most important part. So that suffering is a self, is a growth-inducing, kind of a suffering that we talked about. And then we talked about the practice of mystics, which of course, again, like Baha'is, includes prayers, meditation, reading of the Holy Scriptures, and perhaps equally important is the idea of service and putting into practice, right? Putting into practice. This, particularly in the Baha'i faith, and in some other religious traditions, is important, because in some religious traditions they thought that, I pray, I go to seclusion, I do this, I do that, and I read the Holy Scriptures all day long, but that was the end of it, for that purpose. But particularly we as Baha'is know that that's not enough. It has to be brought to reality, it has to be practiced. Otherwise, without that practice, it's inadequate. It's not complete. We're not complete without it. So we talked about that aspect of it too. And then we said that in this practice, they do it in so many different ways. And it doesn't have to be in one way. So some people just do yoga, right? And they just sing. They get together. How can I go to soup kitchen and help people out? This is all the mystic path, right? It's all the mystic path. And in all of this, in the practice phase, he also talked about the fact, and we went through the whole list, of internalizing what was called the virtues of God, right? You know, in the Baha'i faith, the months, Baha'i months, are the holy attributes of God, right? What month was it, this last feast that we had last night? Questions, you remember that? So every questions. Why is that an attribute of God? It's particular for this age. Because you know that in all previous religious traditions, people were not allowed to ask questions. For 1500 years, Christians were not even allowed to read the Bible. Right? That's my understanding. It was only the preacher who was allowed to do it. Everybody else had to listen to the preacher as to what he says, what he thinks the Bible says. That was part of the reason for the Reformation, right? 1500s. I cannot read. There's also the printing press, which was invented a few years before that. And I want to read it for myself and discover it for myself. And I want to ask questions. But Baha'u'llah says, ask questions. That is an attribute of God. Did you all think about it last night? It's very important. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Do you know that Kitab al-Abbas, our most holy book? How many pages is the most holy book? Mine was 125. So 125. But then, the book that you see as Kitab al-Abbas is 250 pages. The other 125 pages are questions and answers. Baha'u'llah said, I welcome your questions, the Baha'is. You ask me any questions with regard to the laws, and I'll respond to you. And he responded all those questions. So that's also, well, that's just one of the attributes of God, right? So many attributes that we talked about. Now this is before going to the session for today. Now, let me also mention this in passing and very quickly, that one of the friends at the end of the session, after the end of the session, approached me and indicated that I have known some mystics or some Sufis, and a lot of them are prejudiced, or, you know, it's not what you're talking about as to, you know, these divine virtues and this and that, and all that. And I reflected on that question. I reflected on that question. You know, Baha'u'llah says, an hour of reflection is better than 70 years of pious worship. I reflected on that question. And I said, oh God, if I come here and share with you a few things with regard to mysticism and the Baha'i faith, and then next day they said that, you know, there are so many beautiful things in Baha'i faith, but you know, you have. I've seen you get angry, I've seen you say bad things to this and that, and so, you know, why is that? So the point I'm trying to raise is that this is the path, this is the way, but we are all imperfect human beings, right? We're all imperfect beings. I know a number of mystics, a number of Sufis, from whom I have learned so much all my life. As I indicated, including my grandfather and my mother, and here in this town, perhaps a dozen of mystics and Sufis that I just go and admire and just wonder how they can live such a life, which is complete in many ways, the way I see it. And I try to learn from them. So I just want you to think of that. You know, Abdullah has this passage in Persian that I'm sure most of the Persian friends remember. Baha'i رو به صفت شناسند نه به اسم و به خلق پیبرند نه به جسم. That's what Abdullah says, that, you know, a Baha'i is based on the virtues that we talk about is Baha'i and Baha'i faith. But, you know, he goes on saying that somebody may call himself a Baha'i for 50 years, but he may not have internalized these virtues. He's not a Baha'i. And then somebody, Abdul Baha says, may not even have heard of the word Baha'i, but has internalized these virtues. That's the Baha'i that he's talking about. So that's the Sufi we're talking about. That's the mystic that we are talking about. There are thousands of them. And we are all on that path, but we're all imperfect. We're all imperfect. And sometimes my judgment may be wrong, you know? Who am I to judge, right? So this is all of these things need to be reflected upon, thought about. And that brings us then to our discussion for today. And that is, what was the subject?
Poetry.
Art and poetry and mysticism. And that brings us then to our discussion for today. And that is, what was the subject?
Poetry.
Art and poetry and mysticism. Okay, then I thought about this topic, and I reflected on and read about what do these artists and poets say mysticism is. And I found a couple of definitions. So you want to add this to your list of definitions as to what mystic is. So one of them says that mysticism is the love of beauty. Mysticism, love of beauty. I tried to do my best here to show some of these beautiful stuff. So mysticism is the love of beauty. I love that. The other one says, mysticism is an artistic expression of religion in the form of architecture, sculptures, painting, prose, poetry, dance, singing, and music. All of that. So how many was it that we read? 9. We really need 9 sessions to have the singers and the architects and the painters and poets and really good, fine dancers and musicians, mystic music, for each one of them. I really hope that the friends who are in charge of the program think about it. It's 9 programs, at least 9 programs dealing with these 9 aspects, which is so beautiful. I can be the moderator for that. But we can do that.
We'll take volunteers anytime.
Wonderful. So we'll do that. I'm sure that this is something that the group will consider. Now, just before getting to the main part that I'm going to share with you, which is poetry of mysticism, I wanted to share with you very briefly, just touch upon these 9 topics, or at least some of them, for the coming session. One of them, of course, is art in the form of sculpture and then painting. And we know that, particularly starting with the 15th century, there was just an amazing flowering of art in the Western world. And here is when we have Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael and Michelangelo. That's the painting of creation down there. And then the next century and the centuries after that, the Rubens and Bernini and a number of others. Just amazing art. So that was discussion for that. I have those, and you can pass this around, Jennifer. Just look at one of those cities. You know, when I was younger, I loved to go and spend time in just one city, like Rome, and go through these museums and marvel at the beauty of what art can create. But then, as you're looking at that, let me also depict something here. And that is that, you know, we usually have a thought, right? We come up with a thought. How do you write thought? How do you write thought? A thought. Or we may call it an inspiration, right? We have a thought or an inspiration. Now we think it comes from up here, right? So we have a thought and inspiration that comes from God, and that thought and inspiration needs a movement. And that movement is through love that is in all of us. And it will result in this art, which is a beautiful piece of architecture, or poetry, or painting, or whatever. Or a beautiful church, a mosque, or house of worship, right? We have so many of them in the Baha'i faith as well. And then this is, of course, one of the attributes of God, which is beauty. Is that also one of our months? Beauty. Beauty. So this is really what we're going to talk about today. And I was talking about these cities, you know, some of the cities that I visited, I went to each and every museum, or just went and marveled at the buildings. I'll begin with my not my hometown, but my Iran, Isfahan. How many of you have been to Isfahan? There are a few have been to Isfahan. I've seen those beautiful mosques, which was really in praise of the divine as to how those buildings were built. Also at the time of Renaissance, you know, they were all 1500. All beginning of the 1500s, the time of Safavid dynasty. So it all comes from that time period. And then, of course, you know that, you know, just a couple thousand miles to the east of Iran, in India, Taj Mahal, which was also built by those artists and architects of Safavid dynasty. And 1,000 miles so to the west, how many of you have been to Istanbul? Been to Istanbul, and so if you go and see some of those mosques, it's just amazing in terms of beauty and, you know, all of this in praise of the divine. And then from there, in my trip, I went to Rome. Most of the time I took one trip at a time, and Rome, of course, is the center. How many of you have been to Rome? And you've been to Sistine Chapel, and you've been to Peter's Basilica, you know, and that's where you see on the Sistine Chapel, you see the creation, and you see this beautiful marble statue of Mary and Jesus in Basilica, which is so real, so beautiful. It just looks so alive. And that could not have been done without inspiration, right? To bring that object which is alive and talks to us, and that's beauty, absolute beauty. And then, of course, Florence and Venice and Milan, and then the museums in Paris, Louvre, and London, and Brussels. You know, these are, if you want to talk about art and architecture, you've got to really go on at least to 2 or 3 of these cities. And not spend the time in shops, you can do that too, but spend time in these museums. There's so much we learn, and there's so much that we get inspired by, with which we can live, right? And if we can take our children, if we can afford it.
Well, I go to shops because, you know, one of God's titles is the fashion.
Fashion also?
The lawn is very good for that.
Right. No, we don't have to, you know, I said we don't have to spend all the time in a museum, perhaps an hour or 2 in shops too, but some people I know spend 10, 12 hours in shops, and you don't want to spend any time in a museum. Anyway, this is also not a choice, that's why we're all different. Okay, so think about those cities. Now, and before I get to the poetry, let me see if there's anything else I have on this list that I want to share. I also need to mention that any place where there is a semblance of freedom, and there is a freedom, and at the same time not forgetting the divine, you know, the combination. That's where art flourishes. You know, just go back to the time of Athens, where there was a little democracy, And then down the hill was Nile and Egyptians, where there wasn't democracy. And if you study the art of that time period, have you looked at the Egyptian art and the art of Athenians and Greece of that time period? And you see the distinction, you see the difference. And that difference is mainly that in that Greek art, you see form, you see perspective of that. And in that Egyptian art, under those authoritarian rule, you see what? You see flat. It's flat and not dynamic. There's no movement. And you just see that from time to time. Of course, then after the Roman Empire, with all the decadence, they had a semblance of democracy and freedom. Then we come to Dark Ages. I had a debate as to how long was Dark Ages, but Dark Ages, Crusades, and Inquisition was 1,000 years. 700 to 1700, when it was the beginning of Age of Enlightenment. And so, toward the end of it, which was 15th, 16th century, then we had Michelangelo and others. But before that, again, go to the museum, particularly the museum in Brussels. I don't know if I and Jennifer went to Brussels, if you remember that or not, but there's a huge museum, and room after room is the art of 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th century. And all you see is flat and darkness. It's dark and flat and no spirit. I mean, at least, you can't see the spirit the way you see the spirit in this art. So, there is something to democracy and freedom in terms of flourishing of art of different kinds. Well, this was just introduction to the next 9 sessions that we'll probably have, and now I come to my part, and now I have asked the assistance of my beautiful daughter-in-law, Jennifer, that when I read these poetry, and mostly the poetry of the East, mostly the poetry of Rumi, if I say something in addition to that poem, I really spoil it. So what I'd like to do is just read that poem, ask you to reflect on it, and then ask Jennifer to write a word or two as to who that poem was from and what was the main theme of that poem. And again, one more thing before I begin that, Rumi says that in your light, I learn how to love. In your beauty, how to make poems. You dance inside my chest when no one sees you. But sometimes I do. And that sight becomes this art. And this idea of love and beauty and inspiration. You're not a mystic until you're like the earth. Both the righteous and the sinner tread upon it. And until you're like the clouds, they shade all things. And until you're like the rain, it waters all things, whether it loves them or not. If you get rid of yourself just once, the secret of secrets would open to you. The face of the unknown hidden behind the universe would appear on the mirror of your perception. Be like the earth, so that roses may grow in you. For nothing other than soil can be a medium for the growth of roses. God exalts the humble and humbles the proud. آنها که طلبکار خدایید 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 بیرون ز شما نیست شمایید شمایید چیزی که نکردید گم از بحر چه جویید و در طلب گم نشده بحر چه آیید. For 30 years I sought you, I sought God. But when I looked carefully, I found out that in reality God was the seeker and I was the sought. I've spent my life, my heart, and my eyes this way. I used to think that love and beloved are different. I know now that they're the same. I was seeing one in two. ای قوم به حج رفته کجایی کجایی معشوق همینجاست بیایی بیایی. By day I praised you and never knew it. By night I stayed with you and never knew it. I always thought I was mean, but no, I was you and never knew it. My heart is on fire. In my madness I roam the desert. The flames of my passion devour the wind and the sky. My cries of longing, my wails of sorrow are tormenting my soul. You wait patiently, looking into my intoxicated eyes. You accept my passion with the serenity of love. You are the master of existence. One day I shall be a lover like you. There is a way of breathing that is shame and suffocation. And there is another way of expiring, a love breath that lets you open infinitely. You have been the prisoner of a little pond. I'm the ocean and its turbulent flood. Come merge with me, be with me. Leave this world of ignorance. I'll open the gate to your love. One of the latent vices and secret maladies of the lower self is the love of praise. بمیرید در این عشق بمیرید در این عشق چو مردید همه روح پذیرید. Those who are dead to the lower self are alive in God. Continuous attention to God produces the gradual transmutation of the attributes of the lower self into the attributes of God. ای دل ز جان گذر کن تا جان جان ببینی بگذار این جهان را تا آن جهان ببینی. Die in this love. If you die in this love, your soul will be renewed. Die, don't fear the death of that which is known. If you die to the temporal, you'll become timeless. Die, don't fear the death of that which is known. If you die to the temporal, you'll become timeless. Die, cut off those chains that hold you prisoner to the world of attachment. Die to the deathless, and you'll be eternal. Die and come out of the cloud. When you come out of the cloud, you'll be the effulgent moon. Die to the din and the noise of the mundane concerns. In the silence of love, you'll find the spark of life. The signs of misfortune lie in 4 conditions. Eyes that have never experienced tears, a heart that is cruel and hard, long chains of desires that never end, and wishing for an extremely prolonged life. Avoid greed, for greed in itself is poverty. God will not show mercy to him who does not show mercy to others. It's one of my favorites. Even after all this time, the sun never says to the earth, you owe me. Even after all this time, the sun never says to the earth, you owe me. Look what happens with a love like that. It lights the whole sky. Envy consumes good deeds as fire consumes wood. God has made a polish for everything that tarnishes. And the polish for the heart is remembrance. Prayers. If words come out of the heart, they will enter the heart. But if they come from the tongue, they will not pass beyond the ears. True wealth is not in abundance in property, but the generous heart. The person who repents is like one who has never sinned. None of you is a true believer until he wishes for his brother what he wishes for himself. An hour of reflection is better than 70 years of pious worship. You've heard that one before. Different variations of it comes from. If love manifests itself within you, it has its origins in beauty. You are nothing but a mirror in which beauty is reflected. Because beauty and its reflection are both from that one source. It is both treasure and treasure house. چه تدبیری مسلمانان که من خود را نمیدانم، نه ترسا و یهودیم، نه گبرم، نه مسلمانم، نه شرقیم، نه غربیم، نه بریم، نه بحریم، نه ارکان طبیعیم، نه از افلاک گردانم. مکانم لا مکان باشد، نشانم بی نشان باشد، نه تن باشد، نه جان باشد، که من از جان جانانم. اگر در عمر خود روزی دمی بی او برآوردم، از آن وقت و از آن ساعت ز عمر خود پشیمانم. What is it to be done, O Muslims? For I do not recognize myself. I'm neither Christian or Jew, nor Gab, nor Muslim. I'm not from the east or of the west, nor of the land, nor of the sea. I'm not of nature's mint, nor of circling heavens. I'm not of India, nor of China, nor of Bulgaria, nor of Samarkand. I'm not of the kingdom of Iraq, nor of the country of Khorasan. My place is the placeless. My trace is the traceless. It is neither body or soul, for I belong to the soul of the beloved. I have put duality aside. I have seen that the two worlds are one. One I seek, one I know, one I see, one I call. روزها فکر من این است و همه شب سخنم که چرا غافل از احوال دل خویشتنم. از کجا آمدم؟ آمدنم بهر چه بود؟ به کجا میروم آخر ننمانی وطنم. How shall a man know God? How shall a man know God? That's the final lesson from this series. Not by senses, for he is immaterial. Not by intellect, for he is unthinkable. Not by philosophy, for it sees double. But rather through the window of your soul, when he succeeds in self-purification. Through prayers, service, and godly living. Should I read it again? How shall a man know God? Not by senses, for he is immaterial. Not by intellect, for he is unthinkable. Not by philosophy, for it sees double, but rather through the window of his soul when he succeeds in self-purification through prayers, service, and godly living. Ultimately, حوصله عمرم سه سخن بیش نیست خام بودم پخته شدم سوختم. Rumi says, I was raw, I matured, and then finally I was annihilated. I became nothing. That's the last value, the seventh value. We do all of that to become that drop in that ocean. And then we live forever. This world in which we are shut, and in which through our ignorance, we spend our lives in folly and desolation. When death comes to open the lid of the coffin, each one who has wings will fly off to eternity. But those without will remain locked in the coffin. So, my friends, before the lid of the coffin is taken off, do all you can to become a bird of the way to God. Do all you can to develop your wings and your feathers.